Welcome you all tonight to our, tonight's program is a film, but we also have a couple of guest panelists here, one from the National Wildlife Federation. Her name's Catherine Bose, and she's a program manager for Northeast Offshore Wind Programs, so she'll have some relative comments to say about this project here. And then we also have Christopher Bohlke. He's Field Office Supervisor for NOAA Fisheries and Habitat Conservation, and he'll also have something to say. Now, the interesting thing about tonight's program is that through our educational efforts so far this fall, we've started out with programs basically to educate us about climate change and some of the impacts, and then we've transitioned over to talking about climate change and getting other people involved in understanding what's going on, and sort of building this groundswell of concern and thinking about how we need to deal with this. Now, this program here talks about actually doing some things, and this happens to be a program about offshore wind, which is a great resource here in New England. But how to make that a project like that successful by engaging all the various stakeholders that have an interest in the ocean waters offshore. And this is a great blueprint to make things happen, I guess. So the format tonight is going to be, we're going to show the film, and then afterwards, we're going to have our two panelists share some comments, and then we're going to open it up to the audience for various questions and commentary. So just to keep things rolling, I think we'll get started.
To the landlubber, the average person, it looks like a flat expanse of all the sameness. But to these people here, there's a topography under that water and in the islands and the ledges and things that are out that is just as real as if you lived inland and you had your neighbor's house and you had this street and a park over here. Everything out there is named. A lot of these people who come into it from the land side or the government side or the planner side think that they're starting with a clean slate. They think that there's a clean sheet of paper, and here we are, we're going to start this planning thing. But it's not the case. These places have a long history. Fishing has been here for over 400 years with Europeans. And Native Americans have been here, God knows, you know.
If you're a developer and you're going to put in some sort of wind energy or current energy and you're going to invest billions of dollars, it would be nice to know that there's not an ancient burial ground there that's at the end of the day require you to move. It would be to the federal government's advantage, to BOEM's advantage, you know, to the state's advantage, and to investors and developers, and especially our tribes, to know where those sites are. And we need to do that research. But it gives us the advantage to fall back on that ancient history, but it also gives us the chance to plan for the future.
Navy has been here really since the inception of the country. This has been our traditional training area. And so we've been doing this pretty much unobstructed for over 200 years now. In the past, we haven't had to worry about a lot of man-made obstructions offshore. With this new development in the oil and gas reserves as well as offshore windmill interest, we've had to start balancing, okay, where are these going to go? What are they going to interfere with? How is it going to impact our access? A lot of folks just think it's about ships. Well, really, we operate above the water, on the water, and under the water. Nothing worse than getting really advanced in the planning area, spend a lot of money, only to find out that, well, that's where the Navy drops some ordnance, or that's where the Navy does its submarine operations. And we believe that ocean planning is going to be the key, making sure that everybody is understanding of everybody's mutual interests and come up with an equitable solution.
There are decisions we need to make about what we want our marine ecosystems to look like. And this is unbelievable. There are 0 no-take marine areas in the Gulf of Maine. There is nowhere that is completely sacrosanct. So we need these areas of replenishment that would have the chance to adapt to the change in climate and then carry the seeds for the new communities that will repopulate New England waters. We have to strengthen and bolster the natural resilience as much as possible so we go into this time of challenge as strong as we can be.
This is indeed a time of challenge, to begin serving the seas as they have long served us. The ocean's once boundless capacity as unparalleled provider of food, of livelihoods, of the very air we breathe, is reaching its limit. But on that same troubled horizon also comes a hopeful new spirit of collaboration. Unlikely alliances of would-be rivals and competitors. Those who depend most intimately on the sea are joining forces to take better care of the ocean. One such alliance is now taking shape off the coast of New England, where the legendary winds of the Atlantic itself are pushing the boundaries of ocean stewardship.
The region from New Jersey to Massachusetts has been called the Saudi Arabia of offshore wind. So we have thousands of gigawatts of energy, and not only is the wind really strong, but it's located very close to these enormous population centers on the East Coast. So the transmission link between that big energy resource and these big population centers is really quite easy. So the opportunity, not just for clean energy, but to create lots of great jobs, is really enormous here in the U.S. for offshore wind.
If we look at our carbon footprint here in the United States, and we look at the energy that's generated and consumed by electricity, 78% of the electricity is consumed by 28 coastal states. So that means that essentially that energy demand is a coastal problem. And if we want to attack it, we need to start looking at energy sources that don't generate carbon footprints. We look at it from off-the-shelf technology that we can use today that would have any substantial impact that becomes wind energy.
The windy expanses of America's Atlantic coast are estimated to possess the untapped power to supply the region's entire needs for electricity, transportation, and heating, while cutting its greenhouse gas emissions by nearly 60%. But with the wind's great promise comes the challenge of fitting this new energy industry amid an already crowded ocean. a challenge being met by a cadre of pioneering planners in Rhode Island, the Ocean State.
I've had 30 years experience in marine permitting, and we've seen a lot of projects come through that have chosen sites that are inappropriate for various types of development, and that generates a lot of controversy when that happens. Our Office of Energy Resources wanted to develop a large-scale wind farm offshore, straddling both state and federal waters of about 200 turbines. And then they asked what our reaction was, and we told them they were crazy, they were going to get killed in any type of public process that we engaged in when we went forward. From there, we started to talk to them about shifting that into a planning process and developing what we call a special area management plan, but a planning tool that allows us to look at the entire area and consider that for all the potential sites, as well as the resources and the users that use that area.
Rhode Island saw opportunity in the challenge, not only to identify options for developing offshore wind power, but to prepare for the full gamut of impending demands upon the state's ocean waters. The state directed funding and a 2-year deadline for the Rhode Island Ocean SAMP, shorthand for Special Area Management Plan.
When we first started, many people in the Rhode Island community said, we don't want turbines and this is going to ruin our lives. So this is how we started the Ocean SAMP process. Now, URI has been involved in helping the state of Rhode Island make difficult decisions on coastal issues for over 50 years now. And so our group in particular has been able to build trust within, whether it be the municipalities, within to some degree the fishing community, marine trades, etc. And so we started by making a list of who do we think needs to be part of this process.
The list ran long, ranging from federal, state, and municipal agencies to labor unions and Indian tribes. It included fishermen and shippers, NGOs and environmental watchdogs, all focused on the immediate question of wind power, but ultimately looking for a say in their ocean's well-being.
It's really about looking at that natural ecosystem, looking at how people are using the ocean, and protecting and enhancing what's out there now, and promoting and encouraging other activities that are compatible to those efforts.
Many states have some form of coastal zoning, but only a few, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and Oregon, have developed comprehensive ocean plans.
Wind is one aspect of comprehensive marine spatial planning. Trying to decide, okay, is the area suitable for wind or is it more suitable for something else? At the start of the SAMP, there wasn't a lot of existing data. You know, that there had been a lot of mapping done in Long Island Sound. There had been a fair amount of mapping done in Massachusetts, and in the offshore waters of Rhode Island, very little had been done. Developers, their driving metric is, okay, what's the wind resource? Because that tells me how much power I'm going to make and how much money I'm going to make. If the wind speed doubles, you get 8 times as much power. So the first thing you determine is, okay, where's the wind? After that, the first thing you have to do is figure out, okay, where can we absolutely not build a wind project?
And we looked at what types of data we would need to put together that would be areas, for instance, that are no-go sites right out of the gate. So those would be things like navigation areas. They would be unexploded ordnance areas. They would be sites with severe geological constraints, those types of things.
The team then gathered information on spawning and nursery habitats, as well as other ecologically sensitive areas and hotspots for marine biodiversity. From there, they started charting the who, what, and where of Rhode Island's maritime patrons, from Navy sailors and industrial shippers to sailboat racers, scuba divers, and whale watchers, across an expanse of ocean nearly matching the size of the state itself. But when it came to accounting for one of Rhode Island's oldest seafaring communities, there came a snag.
It's very difficult to get fishermen to say anything beyond everywhere is important. We use everywhere.
I mean, I've worked long and hard to get what I know. Somebody might like to know what I know, you know, and go up and down the dock. Every single guy might say that. He's got his secrets. Am I thrilled about having to put what I know on the table to prove it? No, not at all.
We started out with the ocean SAMP. It didn't start off well. It was ugly. It was really ugly. We were pretty upset multiple times. Well, I've got a lot invested in this business. To have it, you know, pulled out from under me, I'm just going to be another one in the unemployment lines right now. You know, I mean, everything we have, you know, this old dock, I mean, you won't have anybody left here if this goes the wrong way.
You know, fuel is going to have to pony up and say, hey, this is important to me and this is why. And somebody's going to have to show them why it's important. You're going to have to show them your grounds. So I decided I'd trust Grover and David enough to be able to give them access to that under full confidentiality, of course, you know. But hey, these are grounds that are important to at least the scallopers that I represent. You got to put your money where your mouth is at a certain point. You can't just have a bunch of guys running around saying, that's my favorite spot. Sooner or later, you got to prove it. Unfortunate, but true. Sooner or later, you got to prove it.
Data that's been gathered by Deepwater Wind in terms of investigating.
Ultimately, the fishermen said to us, we want to help you site this because we want it to go in a place that's going to do the least impact to us versus you choosing a site and then we're going to have to try to live with it. And so that's essentially what occurred. They worked with us very closely, coming out with a mapping process that would allow us to focus in on sites that they had the least concern. Not that they didn't have any concern, but the least concern.
That's all we're asking for is a fair shake in this process. Just don't want to get run over by it. I've been able to meet with the people that are making the decisions. I've met from everywhere from our governor, you know, to Grover Fugate at CRMC, who's in charge of the SAMP process. Most important part is identifying the right area for a wind farm, so you're not ruining the resources, you're not messing up critical habitat.
We have to have conversations within the government, and we have to have the conversations directly with the developer. But none of this would happen without this sort of process. So, yeah, I think it's overall a good thing. It gets people going round and round and getting their needs on the table. Has to happen.
With fishermen gradually coming on board, Rhode Island was now able to designate a renewable energy zone in the most appropriate area, making room for the Block Island Demonstration Wind Farm.
So the Block Island Wind Farm will be located 3 miles to the southeast of Block Island in Rhode Island. It's a 5-turbine project. They produce a lot of power. 17,000 homes can be powered by the 5-turbine project. And we're building it because we don't have any offshore wind farms in the U.S. today. And there are over 50 offshore wind farms in Northern Europe right now with several thousand turbines in the water. The U.S. is way behind. In order to build the industry, we need to start building projects. We believe the best way to do that is to start with a small project to demonstrate that we can do it here in the U.S., and then we will be looking at larger and larger projects, just like they did in Northern Europe.
But there were other voices yet to be heard, whose ancestors were the first people to ever make a living on these shores. Under the guidance of John Brown, medicine man of the Narragansett Indian tribe, Doug Harris is charged to preserve the tribe's ceremonial landscapes.
The oral history of the tribe says that more than 15,000 years ago, the ancient Narragansett lived out where the ocean is now. Those villages overnight began to be inundated with water, and the people had to evacuate. That story was shared with the people, with stakeholders at the Ocean SAMP, and a year and a half later, the geologists working with the Ocean SAMP came back and said, well, you know what you said about 15,000 years ago? Well, the geological record would indicate that at least 24,000 years ago, what is now the continental shelf was an open vegetated plain. So science finally caught up to tribal oral history in terms of the realities of the ocean.
The siting for the Block Island Wind Energy Project straddles the ancestral homeland of the Manistee Band of the Narragansett Indian tribe. From the mainland shore to Block Island and all the water between, this is their historic neighborhood, now in need of new considerations. For Native American cultural sites by law are to be protected on land and in the sea.
Part of what you need to do before you install something really large in the ocean is figure out where you're going to install it and make sure that you're not installing your equipment, your cables, and your foundations for the wind turbines on top of something that's already there. And that could be a boulder, but it also could be an important archaeological site that's submerged.
This Sinmar site is 23,000 years ago.
When we were working with the Narragansett Indian tribe, they became very interested in the possibility that there were tribal encampments in the offshore environment. Sea level was about 300 feet lower than it is today, so the shelf would have been dry, arable land that was capable of supporting populations in the offshore. The problem was that nobody really knew how to go about doing that. We started in a very rudimentary exercise of what's called paleo landscape reconstruction. So using the data that we had in terms of the sub-bottom data so that we could start to peel back, if you want, the sediment layers on the ocean so that we could see what that old landscape looked like. You can start to pick out the river channels, the lake beds, those areas where there might have been potential encampments.
Most of what we see out there is relict from when the glaciers were around a long time ago. We're talking about when this was land, about 24,000 years ago. And it's been subsequently inundated as the glaciers melted and went back into the ocean and sea level rose.
So our challenge is to find the elements of the old...
What scientists are looking for is the archaeological confirmation of the Narragansett Indian tribe's oral history. If somehow they should find the remains of an ancient civilization down there, one yet to be obliterated by rising waters and the depths of time, the prevailing textbook chronologies describing the first human footsteps in North America will be forced to backpedal some 10,000 years into the past.
We know every day history's being changed. We're finding species that we didn't know exist. Where people come from, did they come from western side of, the world or did they come from the east or both? I mean, these things are always in debate and always changing. They should never be put in stone. I'm very excited that we're taking the lead in these things. We're working with scientists, universities, and we are actually being able to rely on that traditional knowledge for once and bring that to the table.
The Block Island Wind Farm project gave us the opportunity, both with the archaeologist, Public Archaeology Laboratory, and the federal agencies and the state agencies, to better understand how we take what it is that we do on land out onto the ocean. And because Deepwater Wind was committed to best practices, it has been a relatively painless process. We have questions, they try to provide answers. If there are issues that we have, they try to provide solutions. And that's a good partnership.
Certainly the largest, if perhaps the rarest stakeholders in Rhode Island were those living beneath the waters.
The North Atlantic right whale is the most critically endangered whale species on the planet. There are approximately 400 animals left. Rhode Island Sound has been home to the most significant aggregations of North Atlantic right whale ever documented. We've had close to 100 right whales feeding in Rhode Island Sound and Block Island Sound in April.
Marine mammals are vitally dependent on sound for navigating and speaking among their kind. The very sort of communication in danger of being drowned out by ships and offshore development. The right whales venturing into Rhode Island Sound to feed suddenly faced a new dilemma.
Environmental organizations raised the concern to us that our initial construction schedule had us in the water with pile driving equipment just about the same time they believed that the North Atlantic right whale could be in the same area.
All sides were wanting to find a way forward for both wind energy and whales.
And for us, April wasn't on the table in Block Island. That was something we could not compromise.
We had the opportunity to sit down with some right whale experts from academic institutions here in the Northeast who shared a lot of data with us. And we were able to take that data, compare it to our construction schedule, and change our schedule, frankly, to accommodate the North Atlantic right whale.
We want to make sure that offshore wind succeeds in the United States. We believe that climate change is a real and significant threat, and that responding to climate change is going to require that we build offshore wind. That being said, we understand that with all energy sources, there are impacts. We have to do it right. The way to do that is to bring everybody who has an opinion about it to the table and to give them a voice, and to ultimately to make your decisions based on science, based on data.
The gathering of data is at the heart of this groundbreaking study off the southern shore of Block Island, where fishermen and scientists are working hand in hand on the trawler Virginia Maurice.
Most of the people in the industry feel that it's necessary to see how these proposed wind farms are going to affect the resource. And the best way to do that is to come out here on a regular basis and get samples of what is actually here. I fish in this area quite often, so I know what should be here when we come. I have an idea of what we should catch.
In collaboration with Coastal Vision and funding from Deepwater Wind, the independent nonprofit Ocean Science and Policy Group Seaplan is directing multi-year studies, collecting monthly data before, during, and after construction of the Block Island wind farm to determine its potential impacts on fisheries.
This is one of two big studies that we have underway. This is our groundfish trawl survey. We also have a lobster survey. And what we're trying to take a look at is to understand whether there are any impacts associated with the construction and operation of an offshore wind farm. Offshore wind farms have never been built in U.S. waters. So well before we put steel in the water here, we're going to know a lot about the groundfish populations in the lobster resources. And then when the construction happens, we'll be measuring those resources, and then for years after that. So it's a real, offshore wind's a pioneering industry, and this is a real pioneering study.
1.95, 1.7.
So we don't really know what to expect, but by looking at the Block Island project as a demonstration, we should be able to get a really good sense of what we're up against when they want to go put 200 of these turbines on our best fishing grounds that we have access to for the, the small inshore fishermen. We're hopeful that this will all work out and we can all get along, whether it's, with the wind farm developers and, everybody comes out as a winner.
I've been in the industry for 43 years, and the people in the industry seem to have faith in me doing the survey because of my experience, I guess, and they seem to trust my abilities to do things right, my desire to do things right. I want to make sure that the right information goes in for the benefit of my fellow fishermen and the people of Rhode Island.
What we learned from this project is going to be really helpful in how the region tackles regional ocean planning issues and decisions. Butterfish, 31.
That, in my opinion, is a critically important piece of getting these offshore wind farms done in the U.S. Engaging with the tribes, engaging with commercial fishermen, with environmental organizations. And had we not done that work with them up front, and we proceeded to try to install the project, then we really would have had a problem. Because then we're looking at potential lawsuits and really expensive delays in installing the project. So spending the additional time and effort up front to engage the stakeholders so that we all agreed on the protocols and we all agreed how we were going to analyze the data made the most sense to us. The ocean SAMP has saved us years of development work.
So it's absolutely good for business, no matter what business you're in. If you're in a marine business, taking into account the information so that you don't make stupid siting decisions is good business any way you cut it.
Founded on science, a shared sense of stewardship, and an alliance of unlikely allies, the collaboration in Rhode Island is leading the way towards a nationwide sea change in ocean conservation.
Often marine spatial planning is framed as dealing with a problem, but I see it as an incredibly exciting opportunity. I know this sounds a little Pollyanna, but what people may not realize is that we are confronting two of the greatest challenges facing global society, and now we have an opportunity to lick these challenges right in our own backyard and then spread what we've learned. And those two challenges are, one, to see the world as a system instead as a collection of independent pieces, and two, to fully value what we get from that system.
So we're at a current depth of 1344 meters. We launched the ROV this morning about 8:45. And we have been surveying the east wall of Black Canyon. We're currently about 100 miles off the coast of Rhode Island, pretty much due south.
We are working up our first wall transect. Large number of corals, including huge numbers of deep sea corals, probably some of the more densely populated wall face that we've seen on this cruise.
Most of the laws and approaches that we have right now to marine resource management deal with the ocean piecemeal. Fisheries deal with fishes one species at a time. We deal with economic sectors one at a time. And we know this is wrong. We do it this way because it's simpler. And we make the simplifying assumption that when you run cargo ships in and out of Boston Harbor, it has nothing to do with whales. Or that when you catch haddock, it has nothing to do with cod or herring. And we know that's not true. It's just been a big bite to get beyond that, to acknowledge that species compete with each other, and that whales get run over by boats very easily. If you make a simple intervention like restricting destructive fishing practices to places where they have the least impact, the entire system and everybody dependent on it will benefit. If you adjust shipping lanes so that they have minimal interference with marine mammals, the whale watch industry, the boating industry, the fishing and recreational fishing, they all benefit. So the key to making marine spatial management efficient is to back up and take a systems view.
Now that state ocean planning has been demonstrated successfully in Rhode Island and Massachusetts, the Northeast is embarking on comprehensive ocean planning for the entire region. And like their counterparts in Rhode Island, they are coming to grips with the complexity of a living ocean that knows no political borders.
And fishermen have asked that several times, is we don't know how all these projects connect to each other. We'd like to see a bigger picture. There's projects proposed for Massachusetts, right on the Mass-Rhode Island border, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Virginia, all the way down the coast. They have these grand plans to put quite a few different projects up, wind farms. Fish don't know state boundaries, and they migrate up and down the coast, and our fishermen also don't know state boundaries. So many of the fishermen here in Rhode Island fish to the north of Rhode Island, fish to the south, as far down, probably up and down the entire coast, really, but the whole northeast region anyway, you'll find Rhode Island fishermen targeting species that they look for to earn their income. I know it's a lot of work, I know there's a ton of meetings, and I get it, everyone's tired, but this is an important thing, and we can have all the fish in the world if we can't go get them because our areas are shut down, or they put all these things up in areas that we would normally go get those fish, then what good is all of this fisheries management stuff? So it's an important part for us to participate in, I believe that. It made sense to do it on a state level for us here in Rhode Island. It makes even more sense, in my opinion, to have a regional approach to that planning.
Rhode Island and Massachusetts' experience of using science and collaboration to solve conflicts over their state ocean resources is now being put into action across the entire Northeast region. Representatives from the New England states, Native American tribes, and the federal government are co-leading the regional planning for a marine world stretching 200 miles offshore.
BOEM is very much involved in the Northeast right now and in other regions in ocean planning. It fits in very, very nicely with our mission, which is to engage stakeholders and get everyone's input on which areas are the best for ocean energy development.
This large area of North Carolina, that will shrink.
So what's different now is that the federal agencies are communicating much more, not only with the states and other partners and tribes, but among ourselves. And so the real benefit to the marine planning that we see is the sharing of information, the sharing of scientific data.
That data is being shared with everyone through the Northeast Ocean Data Portal. Looking through the portal, we see a multitude of ocean uses. Disposal sites, unexploded ordnances, pipelines, submerged cables, aquaculture areas, renewable energy zones, turtle migration routes, and whale feeding grounds. Looking through the portal, we see an ocean in need of sharing.
Let's say a potential developer comes in and they have a project in mind and they want to lease a specific area or offshore to do that project. The sooner they understand some of the constraints that are out there, and you'd be surprised, no matter where you look out there, there are constraints. And so what it becomes is they can focus their resources on honing into a more realistic area right off the bat. And that can save a lot of time and money and, frankly, heartache. So when you're looking at how to plan for an additional use, in this case offshore renewable energy, the National Ocean Policy is sort of guiding us to work with all constituents to find the best area with the least conflict out there with other uses.
We're talking to a lot of industry, commerce, aquaculture, energy, fishermen, recreational users, to get a sense of where they see their future going. Aquaculture hasn't even really gotten out of the gate in terms of setting its own use offshore. They have an urgency here to sort of understand how their use might be compatible with existing uses. Commerce has very clearly talked about more shipping. on the water, more commerce in terms of the Panama Canal being deepened, the Arctic opening.
75% of the U.S. goods and services, the imports and exports, are done through our ocean highways. That accounts for about $1.1 trillion worth of goods that come across our borders through the ocean highways. Any disruption to these commercial highways could cause a significant impact to our overall economy as well as the global economy. The Navy's mission is to protect those highways, to make sure that we have access to those highways so we can operate in them safely and transport those goods and services.
Those types of very important uses to our economy need to be planned in a more comprehensive way and in the context of all these other important uses, in addition to the natural resources that we need to be considering on this larger regional scale, like whales, birds, marine mammals, turtles. You really do need to take a step back and look regionally. It's not the feds who are the experts here, it's the states. They are the seasoned leaders around this table that are most closely connected to their own state's economies, to the coastal communities.
My name is Tom Burak. I am one of New Hampshire's 2 representatives to the regional planning body. And we're also joined by several other members of the regional planning body this afternoon, including Doug Grout, who is the representative for the New England Fisheries Management Council. In addition, we have Dan Hubbard from the U.S. Coast Guard, right there, and we have Betsy Nicholson from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Again, we're really excited that this process is underway.
Although we may not have a lot of coastal mileage, the coast is still a very important part of our history, part of our culture, part of our economy. If we failed to undertake this work, we would see ever-increasing tensions and conflicts over our oceans, and people finding themselves in very contentious situations, whether it's wind energy projects trying to be built in places where fishing interests don't want to see those things occurring, whether it's other kinds of energy development projects occurring in places where they might interfere with recreational activities or shipping lanes. We're just going to see ever-increasing tensions and conflicts if we don't find a way together to address them. By working together, we have much greater impact.
So what is that?
This, in many ways, is about the rights of states. This is very much about states' rights. This is about states being able to sit as equals at the table with the feds and saying, these are our concerns. You need to hear us. We need to address them. And that, I think, is vitally important as well.
In addition to the Northeast, the U.S. National Ocean Policy identified 8 ocean regions: the Mid-Atlantic, the South Atlantic, the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, the West Coast, Alaska and the Arctic, the Pacific Islands, and the Great Lakes. The National Ocean Policy calls for these regions, if they so choose, to develop a plan for how their offshore waters will be developed or not. It's a plan that calls on everyone's voice.
Part of the advantage working on the water day in and day out is that you start to see the realities of climate change. We may be poor dumb fishermen, but we know that lobsters shed 4 weeks earlier than they almost ever have. And then you read the scientific data afterwards that the whole Gulf of Maine was so many degrees warmer over that year. So even if we wanted to have our heads in the sand, it wouldn't last very long. One way or the other, you're torn between the fear of being displaced somehow out there in the water and realizing that we have to maintain a healthy resource, a healthy ocean, a healthy resource. And those decisions are being made now, so I'd like to participate and I'd like to help.
There's Navy interest, there's Air Force interest, there's Marine Corps interest, so there's Coast Guard interest, and all of those have to be balanced to ensure that, one,
we're able to support the commerce that we'd like to sustain, manage our energy needs through this alternative energy initiatives, but at the same time maintain our proficiency in our operating forces so that we can safely protect those economic interests as well.
This entire process of coastal and marine spatial planning is singularly and solely about us, about people. What's different about it is that instead of just thinking about the people alive today, for the first time, we're thinking seriously about our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren. We're thinking about sustainability. What's going to be increasingly important in the future is replenishment, restoration of renewable resources. And what we're restoring is not just the number of fish or the beauty of the coastline, but its ability to continually renew itself. So this planning is not just for the next 5 years. It's for the next 500 years.
Okay, so I'd like to turn the mic over to our two panelists, and I guess we'll have Catherine Bowes go first to share her comments about the movie, and then we'll have Christopher Bolton for his comments, and then we'd like to hear your questions.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Not really.
No.
Yeah, you have to turn it right up.
Do I have to hold it, or?
No, you just have to be in close.
Okay, how's this? Got it? Okay, all right. So hello, I'm Catherine Bowes with National Wildlife Federation. I'm based up in Vermont, actually, which is the northeast office of National Wildlife Federation. We cover New England, New York, and New Jersey as a region. I'm part of our climate and energy program. As an organization, National Wildlife Federation firmly believes that climate change is the single greatest threat facing wildlife here in Massachusetts, across the country, and around the globe. I know I myself am from the South Shore of Massachusetts, so close by, and certainly have seen the climate impacts facing my hometown and that community, as I know you all have seen very intensely here as well. So that's what brings us to this issue, concern about climate change and interest in seeing clean energy move forward at the scale that we need it to in order to confront this really pressing and urgent threat facing our wildlife and communities. And it's within that frame that we've started to look really very closely at offshore wind energy as an incredible opportunity for the country in this area. There is so much energy out there. As some of the speakers in the film have mentioned, there's over 60 projects now up and spinning around the world at 10 countries. A lot of energy and a lot of jobs being produced. This is not a new thing, it's just new to us, and we don't have a project yet here in U.S. waters, but there are a lot of people working really hard that you saw in the film here, and some in this room to make that happen. So I thought it was a great film. It really provided a close look at what we think has been an incredibly successful venue for helping communities think about how to approach this exciting opportunity of offshore winds. Lots of stakeholders with many concerns about wildlife that certainly we have as an organization as well, and really just a neat way to look at kind of the process that they went through and identifying those sites that are of great wind potential and of great interest to the industry, but also that don't have the range of conflicts that would hold things up. So I think it's a really great case study in how to do this right, and we're engaged in this process. We're following it very closely all along the coast. There's at one point in the film they showed a map with from BOEM of all the different areas that the federal government has identified offshore, and National Wildlife Federation has been following each one of those very closely, trying to ensure again that offshore wind moves forward, but that it moves forward in a way that is respectful and protective of our coastal and marine wildlife. So I could talk about offshore wind power all day long, but look forward to hearing your questions and seeing which areas of this particular issue are of most interest to you. So thanks for coming.
Thanks. So my name is Chris Bolke. I'm with the National Marine Fisheries Service out of Gloucester, Massachusetts. I'm with the Habitat Conservation Division. So basically I have a couple of roles in this issue. The first is through the regulatory role. So the Habitat Conservation Division and the Protected Resources Division with the National Marine Fisheries Service are involved in Endangered Species Act and Essential Fish Habitat consultation processes. So what that would be, for any of these regulatory agencies, whether it's Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, Army Corps of Engineers, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, any of those licenses or permit processes will have to go through consultations with our agency. So in that respect, we are involved in shaping, certainly footprints of projects, but very much the construction and operations of them, whether time of year or certain areas to avoid certain species indoor habitats. The other role that I'm involved in is through the Northeast Regional Planning Body for Coastal Marine Spatial Planning. And with that, I serve as an alternate to Betsy Nicholson, who you saw in the movie. I think it's a fantastic movie as well, and I think what a real key thing to take away from this, it shows all of the existing uses and resources that are out there, and competing uses and resources. And this is not, we're talking here about basically about a lot about offshore wind, but this is something that happens in any permit or license activity that occurs in the ocean, whether it's offshore wind, pipelines, liquefied natural gas, it doesn't matter. You have the same issues that are coming up over and over. So I think, just real quick, one thing to just point out here is that it didn't really clarify it in this movie, but there are two distinct processes that are going on here. There is a planning, all right, we're back. A planning effort here that is dealing with Rhode Island Ocean SAMP, the Massachusetts Ocean Management Plan, and the Northeast Regional Planning Body. And that's the process that's dealing with the data portal to identify existing uses, to look at different types of activities, different areas for potential conservation areas, to look at different activities that may be compatible or may not be compatible with one another, and come up with some kind of plan. But there's also, in addition to this planning process, there's a regulatory process. And that's what the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is doing. So that is going on, and that is a lease process similar to an oil and gas lease process. And that is, it relies a lot on a lot of the planning information that comes out of these planning processes, but is a distinct regulatory process that involves consultations, and those are at different stages. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that, but they're at different stages throughout the Northeast. So anyway, just at that, I would just say that they are these two processes that are kind of intertwined, a little bit separate, and the reason they're a little bit separate, not because it wasn't by design to be separate. There was a Secretary of Interior pushing an offshore wind initiative that was really going forward, the Smart from the Start initiative, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and at the same time, a little bit behind that was the President's executive order on national ocean policy and coastal marine spatial planning. So there's been an attempt to align them as best as we can, but they're not completely aligned. So I guess with that, take some comments?
Sure.
So anybody have some questions?
I have a question. How much resistance is there to this?
Great question. I think it depends. As a wildlife organization, I have some reports that we put out that are in the front of the room here, a recent report that we put out on offshore wind power. We had over 40 national, local, and regional environmental organizations co-sponsor that report with us, which is a pretty strong showing. I would say that all of the major national environmental organizations are strong supporters of offshore wind energy, appropriately cited and managed. That's not to say, thumbs up to offshore wind everywhere, but as a concept, as an energy solution for the country, there is broad agreement among the environmental organizations that this is an important way to go. And I think opposition to offshore wind has ranged from a number of sources. There have been some projects proposed that would be within sight of shore. Cape Wind in Massachusetts is probably the one you've all heard the most about. The Block Island Wind Farm that was mentioned in the movie. There's a project proposed off of Atlantic City in New Jersey. So I think you'll see some opposition from some folks that just don't want to look at it. You also can have heard there was some opposition, as is expressed from potential fishing industry or shipping. Anyone who might see a potential conflict with what they're doing in the water and how a project might impact that. I think examples like the ocean sand process in Rhode Island and what's as you were just discussing, the processes that are playing out for the federal leasing process. As these processes move forward and are bringing more and more stakeholders to the table, it's helping us illuminate those issues and ways to overcome them. So finding those places where there are least conflicts with the interest that I mentioned, and also a sufficient wind resource that is of interest to the industry. So the answer is it depends. What I'm seeing is I work on this issue all day, every day, and far and away we are seeing way more support than opposition. Surely there is opposition in pockets, but when you look at polling and when you look at the outcome of these types of processes that actually bring all the key voices to the table, what we're finding is really a lot of excitement and interest in seeing projects move forward.
Are you saying that there's no or not much deep pocket opposition or corporate opposition, such as there is against, say, single-payer health care or anything like that?
Yes, there is that as well.
There is.
I think if you look at, I think the best example, again, coming back to Cape Wind, there's a long story there, but fundamentally the opposition to that project has been bankrolled by the Koch brother-funded Alliance to Protect Nantucket Sound. So there is quite a bit of deep-pocketed fossil fuel interest money that has an interest in delaying offshore wind projects, right? One of the things Secretary Salazar, as you mentioned, came in, when the Obama administration came in, they launched a big initiative to actually get things going for once in America on offshore winds. And one of Secretary Salazar's favorite talking points, and one of mine as well, was he would say repeatedly, there's enough energy available offshore, just on the East Coast, to power the country 4 times over. And that is exciting, and that is visionary, and those are fighting words to the current dominators of the electricity power market, right? So there are a lot of dynamics at play here for sure, and that's why we certainly think that those of us who see the tremendous opportunity of offshore wind power right now really need to be coming together and speaking up to make this happen, because there's a lot of dynamics at play.
Can I have one more follow-up, and then I promise I'm done? Sure. Why was that left out of this film?
It didn't make the film. It's an interesting question. I think that it would be a question for the filmmakers. I don't know that.
That'd be something to maybe note on your survey form.
Yeah. Yep.
The only other thing I would add with regards to the ocean planning effort, as far as any resistance, as they noted in here, in the film, we've seen from the fishing industry, and that what you have to do with this ocean planning effort, if you're putting out important areas for uses and resources, they have to be put on a map, and people are hesitant to actually put that out there it's a competitive industry. So there's been a lot of resistance to that. But the flip side of it is, if it's not out there, you can't expect people to be avoiding it. So that I would say, for the planning effort, that's the biggest resistance.
With all the development that's been in Western Europe with wind energy, has there been that much planning and development before they sited all those, facilities?
I'm not, there has been some efforts, but I don't think it has been to this level of the National Ocean Policy and Coastal Marine Spatial Planning efforts.
That's what I would say as well, and I think that a lot of the opportunity that we have here in America is to, in many ways, learn from some of the mistakes that they have made, and I think this type of a response of really bringing everyone to the table early, so that we know the issues early, is, I think, one of those lessons learned.
Yeah, I don't know if I got a question, it's more than a comment, but when you look at the film, you have all these concerns of these different interests, and it all appears like they're in conflict. But I believe that these siting of these wind farms actually could benefit fishing, because you're going to put certain areas off limits, and if you're smart, you're going to put them where they spawn, and you're going to keep these fishermen, like we here in Massachusetts lost all our flounder fishing because the state allowed them to fish right up to the beach off Plum Island, which is the primary spawning area of the yellowtail flounder, and we lost the flounder. This seems to me would help.
Yeah, to that, so the Northeast Regional Ocean Planning Body, what they are in the process of doing right now is developing a work plan, and there's three main goals to that. There's interagency coordination, getting data out there. There's looking at healthy coastal and ocean ecosystems, and the third one is dealing with compatibility issues, and they're dealing with that very issue of where everyone, at first glance, you would think that nothing is compatible with one another, but they're really digging down and really identifying some studies and some research to look at what really is compatible with one another, with different types of activities are compatible. So I think that would be, that's not the first thing that the work plan is dealing with, but that's definitely on the agenda for what they're looking to do. Yeah.
I was struck by the 5 windmill turbine pilot program off of Block Island who's planned. When we hear about wind offshore, it's these giant farms, and yet on the land side of things, turbines are popping up all over New England, right? Where there's wind on the coast or in the mountains. Are we at too high a level? Shouldn't there just be 3 here and 5 there, or the economics just don't play that way?
What was the question?
Really, every time I see a wind turbine proposal offshore, it's a big thing. It's 100 turbines, it's 50 turbines, it's whatever. It's a big plot that the feds have leased the land to, or whatever. As opposed to, on the land side of things, it seems like they're economical, 3 here or 2 there, or 1 on 95, 93 south of Boston and Dorchester. There's places where it can be. It would seem to be simpler to say, hey, let's put 3 off Gloucester, then let's put 300 off of Nantucket, and another 3 and another 3. I don't know. I guess it's an economics question, or is it a regulatory question that the worldview is too broad, too gross a lens?
My gut says that for generating enough power, they want to make a big enough splash to power up, let's say, a big section of Boston with a substantial amount of wind energy offshore. Whereas 2 or 3 windmills here or there are going to power up 500, 1,500 homes, and it's not going to make a big enough dent in what we need to do relative to getting off of the whole fossil fuel method of generating electricity. So I think that's what my gut says.
Well, I just want to say, you do see the Block Island Wind Project, that is a demonstration project, but there are other demonstration projects out there. University of Maine is dealing, they have a couple sites up in Maine looking at floating turbines offshore. And they are truly looking at demonstration to really see how they make the technology work to further expand. So a lot of them, some of the pilot projects that you're looking at are really to gather data. The Deepwater Wind, the same people and I don't know if you were going to say the same thing, but the same people that are dealing with that Block Island wind farm are the same developers that have the lease for the broader ocean SAMP area. So it really is, in many cases, a real demonstration project.
To your point, though, about whether the economics would work to do one turbine here and there in the way that it is offshore, it would not. The one thing that we have onshore, in between all of those turbines, is transmission lines. So offshore, in order to connect everything up and bring the power ashore, there's quite a bit involved. And that's really, honestly, why there is this comprehensive ocean planning going into thinking about where the best places are to put them so that we don't, spread that impact across a bigger area. Rather, we, find those spots where it makes the most sense. So, and it does, the way the trend of the industry is going is definitely toward bigger turbines, farther offshore, where you can get a lot more bang for the buck, so to speak, and that's just a better situation to go farther offshore than in the nearshore environment, where you see a lot more conflicts, both with wildlife, with view sheds, with other ocean uses that are closer to shore.
Just a question about, I hadn't heard of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management Resources before.
Okay.
And they're under the Department of the Interior.
Yes.
And you had alluded to the oil and gas lease.
Louder. Yeah, we can't hear her.
Can you repeat the question? Sure.
You had alluded to the offshore oil and gas leasing.
I don't know if I can start again.
Anyway, which is also handled by the Department of Interior, I believe.
Yes.
So I'm just wondering, is that leasing area also included in this ocean management? And what's the relationship between the oil and gas leasing and the leasing for wind farms?
Okay. So well, you hadn't heard the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management because the name changed. It used to be the Minerals Management Service. So now with that, this is just a new name for it. They have different sections. They have a renewable energy section, and they still have an oil and gas leasing program. They are separate. They rely on some of the same leasing mechanisms. I mean, well, they're not the same, but they're based on, this leasing process is based in part on the oil and gas leasing process. But anyway, I've lost my train of thought on that one. But so how are they related? There's not really a, they're just really different sections of Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. This is not included. Oil and gas leasing is, at this point, is not something that's being included in these coastal marine spatial planning effort for, certainly not for Mass or Rhode Island, and not for the Northeast Regional Planning Body. The things that are really being looked at for the Northeast Regional Planning Body are offshore energy, cables and pipelines, sand resources for beach nourishment, as well as offshore aquaculture. So those are, you can deal with a bunch of different things, but these are some of the big things that are being looked at right now, but not oil and gas.
What is the actual relative cost of generating electricity through these large wind farms relative to, let's say, a gas-fired plant, relative to a nuclear plant, relative to solar, relative to a coal-fired plant? In other words, how does it fit economically in the rest of the milieu of power generation?
Great question, and as with many great questions, it depends. The offshore wind energy is relatively more expensive at the moment, as you see with any new thing. Solar, the cost has come down. Onshore wind, the cost has come down. Offshore wind, we're at the beginning here, and so it is largely the increase in cost has to do with the high upfront capital investment of building them. As we know, once they're up and running, there's some operation and maintenance, but the fuel cost will always be free. But the upfront on the capital investment is where the big cost is at the moment. And so to put them on the on a spectrum, so to speak, I think you'd see offshore winds coming in relatively comparable to below, I'd say just above gas here for New England. I'm trying to put it into your context here, where you've got the issue that is part of why it's pens and why it's a complicated issue and why the issue of cost often gets very complicated for folks, is that there's a difference between what the offshore wind developer can charge in terms of, price per kilowatt hour to produce the electricity. And then there's the cost that you pay on your bill, which is to your power company that's a mix of all different energy sources that they may be pulling from, right? So you can throw out numbers like 18 cents for a contract for, for Block Islands, but then you can look at, again, what the actual impact that would have on anyone's rates, and you're talking about something relatively, minimal, like pennies per bill. So our energy system is complicated in terms of how pricing and costs are incorporated into your actual electric bills. The one thing that is important to know about offshore wind is that it is an incredibly valuable energy resource, particularly for coastal states, where offshore winds blows the hardest and the strongest during the day and in the afternoons and those times of peak demand. You all live on the coast, right? Sea breeze starts to pick up in the afternoon, especially on those heat wave hot days, right? And so that's when the wind resource is going to be blowing the hardest, and that's when those generators are going to be producing at capacity, and that's the most valuable time to be producing energy. And so when you look at those types of impacts and how, like, the practical reality of having 1 or 2 or 3, or let's hope many more, offshore wind projects off our coast that our utilities can pull from, what you're actually going to see is an overall lowering of cost, because at those moments when offshore wind can produce the most is when the fossil generators are at their most expensive. So there's an opportunity there to really replace those fossil generators and actually bring down overall costs. So it's a complicated system in the way our energy market works, but what I will tell you is that when you look at the economic modeling of what the practical reality will be of bringing these projects online, what you're going to see is incredible ratepayer benefits to Massachusetts and to the region.
Peter? Follow-up question on the same topic about the cost benefit. I attended a lecture in Boston a couple of weeks ago, and it was pointed out that fossil fuels represent the greatest externality in cost that the world has ever seen, meaning you don't really pay the cost. What are the external costs associated with wind energy? Can you talk to that a little bit?
Well, it's a great point, and one that I think, to follow up on the previous answer, I think when you look at costs, you have to look at the whole picture. You have to look at the costs and the benefits, and I think certainly for offshore winds, when you think about what is the cost, I think thinking about what are the benefits of the avoided fossil emissions that they're able to displace. So as you just said, so I want to make sure I just underscored that point, because it is an important way of looking at it, whether you're talking about everything from the point of fossil fuel extraction to transmission to refining to combustion. Everything about that process with fossil fuels is devastating to wildlife, which is of interest to my organization, but of course people in communities as well who are concerned about pollution and climate change and all those impacts. So for offshore winds, again, as a wildlife organization, we believe the impacts to be relatively very minimal. Primarily, the impact is at the time of construction and the pre-survey work that they do. They showed those photos of the boats and the images they were taking of the bottom of the sea. There's a lot of noise associated with that survey equipment, and so ensuring that when they're doing the extensive surveys that they need to do to design the projects, that they do those in a way that is responsible and respectful to wildlife. So not doing it, for example, at times when we think there may be right whales in the area, because that kind of a sounds can affect right whale impact. So really with offshore wind, it's the externality really, I think you would look at the construction impact. And again, from our perspective, when you look at best management practices, they talked a bit about that in the film. They didn't go into too much detail, but at one point, the Deepwater Winds talks about how they had altered their construction schedule to avoid the month of April, which is the big month of concern for right whales down in Rhode Island Sound. So the external impacts are there. We believe they're minimal, and we believe that they can be sufficiently mitigated.
The only other thing I would add as far as externalities would go would be in the siting process. So if they're not sited properly, then that would be an externality, a conflict with an existing use or future use or resource. And that's where the coastal marine spatial planning process and the data portal comes into play to address those externalities at a time.
The question I have is about when you transmit electricity over land, there's a certain amount of distance that it can only go before you have to generate again to transmit more distance. What's that for wind energy? You're already 200 miles offshore.
I've not heard. Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I'm not an engineer, so I don't.
Maybe, can I ask one more? The thing I'm questioning, or a question coming to mind, is that we're increasing the distance 200 miles offshore, say. But when you do that, do you have to rebuild your infrastructure closer to the coast to compensate for that till we have technology that can change that?
I would imagine there would be some substation along the way need if you're really talking 200 miles out. They're not looking that far at all right now. It's, I think, the closest or the furthest wind energy area is about 20 miles offshore, and that. My understanding, again, I'm not a cable engineer, but the cables that they have planned can bring. There's certain in the bigger farms for the Block Island farm. I believe all 5 transmission lines will come to one central spot where they'll combine and then head to shore in one long. For the bigger farms where you're talking about hundreds of turbines, there certainly will be certain substation, that might not be the right technical term, but points where the cables will come together, where they will then head to shore in a single unit, so as to minimize the impact and the construction that they need to do to bring that cable on shore. So it may be, if you're talking about 200 miles, need for some additional points where they do kind of pull those cables together. But of the concerns that I've heard, or the issues that I've heard about building farther and farther offshore, that isn't one of them. So my understanding is that's a technically achievable situation.
Okay. Let me just add one other thing. So there's also something that's going on in the Mid-Atlantic right now. It's in the planning stage. I think it's actually stalled right now. It's called the Atlantic Wind Connection, and it's a kind of a backbone cable that runs between New York and Virginia, and that would run offshore. And the concept behind that would be one route of cables that goes to shore. Well, there are a couple interconnections, but every single wind farm is not connecting to shore. They're all connecting into this backbone cable. And so any of the offshore, the wind energy areas off New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia are going to interconnect into that. And that's the main cable that's going onto shore. Again, there will be specific points of interconnection, and that certainly does have substations associated with it.
Just a quick point on that. That proposal is for, as you mentioned, in the Mid-Atlantic, but Massachusetts CEC just put out a RFP today, I just saw, for offshore transmission proposals for across the wind energy areas off of southern New England. So certainly there's a lot of environmental benefit to be had by planning this out, strategically looking at the areas and doing it up on the front end so that you don't, then be running lines through areas that are of concern for other issues. So both the transmission and the siting of the projects can benefit a lot from this comprehensive coastal and marine spatial planning.
Notwithstanding the power of the fossil fuel industry, is there any conversation among the scientists and the people dealing with the factual information that would cause the carbon tax to become part of leveling the playing field from an economic point of view? Is that talked about at all, or is that just off the landscape?
It's certainly talked about a lot as something that is desperately needed by those of us, again, who really do see the climate change as a very real threat. Unfortunately, it is not being talked about as in the realm of the politically possible, given the state of Congress right now. So I think there are a number of other ways that those that the Obama administration in particular and state governments are looking to advance clean energy in the absence of that. I think anyone who looks very closely at this problem, the scale of the urgency and the insufficient policy tools we currently have in place to deal with it would very quickly reach the same conclusion that a carbon tax would be incredibly helpful. Unfortunately, there are probably a lot of helpful things our Congress could do, and yeah, here we are.
Thank you.
Yes.
What's the ratio of onshore generation capacity or potential and offshore potential? Has that been compared? We're talking about offshore at this meeting, and we've seen a film that shows the complexity of dealing with offshore. We have experience with onshore generation, and I was just wondering whether the onshore potential and the offshore potential, how they lined up. Is it 2 to 1, 1 to 1, some other ratio?
It depends. Again, if you're talking about the East Coast states, for example, because if we look at the country as a whole, right, how our energy and electricity systems are connected depends where you are in the region and what sources you can pull from and whatnot. So there's a lot of land-based wind, certainly in the plains. In the East Coast, it's, the better wind is up on the ridgelands primarily, and a lot of the developable wind onshore has been built or is in the process of being built. And not to say there isn't quite a bit more that could be built, but particularly in the East Coast, where the closer you get to the shore, as we all know, it gets very, very dense population development. And the opportunities for, I couldn't give you a 2 to 1 ratio number. I'm trying to think of how I could quickly do a back of the envelope to get that for you, looking for just the East Coast. But I think the important note, as I was mentioning earlier about the difference between the onshore and the offshore resource, onshore winds blow strongest at night. And that's not to say that onshore wind is not an important renewable resource that we need to develop. It certainly is. But for the East Coast, the offshore wind resource really does provide a unique and incredibly valuable energy opportunity at scale. Scale meaning power plant size projects, as opposed to the smaller community turbine opportunities that you see in the more densely populated eastern corridor. So I couldn't give you a number off the top of my head, but certainly for the East Coast, it's exponential, the amount of resource potential offshore relative to onshore. And it is a more valuable resource in many ways, given the peak correspondence.
Yes, film gives the impression that this is a litmus test for further development, this 5-turbine site. How far along has it come since the film, as far as acceptance or opposition?
Sure. So that project proposal is currently being reviewed by the State Coastal Resources Management Council, which Grover Fugate, who is the guy in the film, often he's the executive director of that council. So the state is reviewing the permit application. The interesting thing about the Block Island project is it's actually it's in state water, so it's within 3 miles of shore of Block Island. So while it's far offshore from the mainland, it's actually still within state waters, which is a slightly different permitting process than the federal government, BOEM, which you mentioned, is pursuing for the larger area. So in any event, it's going through yet another process to the ones you mentioned. That process is actually going towards public hearings right now. There's actually a hearing next week. that the State Department of Environmental Management in Rhode Island is holding to review the cable landing site, so where the cable from that project will come on shore in Narragansett. That piece of the application is being reviewed next week, and then there's going to be a broader set of public hearings in the next month or two. And then the state will issue their decision on the project. So they've come a long way. They're very close to the end of the line for that project. They have their power contracts in place. One of the really interesting part of what makes watching the offshore wind industry a very interesting topic is that there are two very separate but equally critical processes that have to move forward to make a project happen. Everything that we're talking about here just has to do with getting a lease to build a project on a site, to lease the area and then to get all the permits that you need for the construction and the operations of that project. But what ultimately is going to make that actually turn into a project is a power contract with somebody on shore to sell the power to. And these two processes are entirely separate. So someone like Jeff Grabowski in the film, CEO of Deepwater Wind, who's trying to build a wind project, has to simultaneously navigate both of these processes to a conclusion, which is very challenging. But the Block Island project, your question being how close is it, it has all the contracts, power contracts in hand. That project will connect Block Island to the mainland of Rhode Island for the first time, which is a huge deal for the island. It will power the island completely, replacing the island is currently powered by diesel generators. They ship diesel over on the ferry. It's incredibly loud, incredibly dirty, and Block Island pays the highest electric rates in the country for it. Once this project is up and online, it will entirely power the island. The balance of the power will head up to the mainland, and the island will have the reliability of that transmission line for the first time. So it's a really exciting success story, or will be, when that project is up and running. NWF is a proud endorser of that project. It'll be exciting for all those reasons alone, not the least of which is the really precedent-setting, I think, planning process that led to the site location itself.
Now that we're talking about, we've got the pilot study going in, and we're talking about hundreds of turbines offshore. Is anyone, and we've got an area now cordoned off where you're going to have to keep your boats out of and things like this. Is anyone looking at the possibility of, once you've got that infrastructure all set up and the lines to shore and structures mounted, of somehow combining that with surface wave generation and subsurface turbines and making it a power generation area of using the atmosphere and the ocean? I mean, I've never heard anybody talking about that, but I'm not that involved in this sort of thing. But I've never heard of the numbers like 100 or 200 turbines offshore, because now you've got an area where you can generate surface wave energy and subsurface energy too in the ocean.
Yeah, so I haven't heard about the specifics of combining those two energy sources, but like we were mentioning before, that compatibility piece that is really going to be looking at all types of things, especially one of the things that people are talking a lot about is offshore aquaculture, combining that with offshore wind. So I think that compatibility piece for the regional planning body is something where that would get discussed. I don't know, did you?
I haven't heard about developers combining the two. I know that UMass Dartmouth is doing some interesting research in this area, and I think it's newer. Offshore wind power, again, while it's new to us, 20 years of experience overseas. Exactly. Yeah. And there's a lot of experience really on the onshore industry too, to draw from. So I think some of these other areas of ocean power are just not quite as far along in terms of the commercial availability and proven nature of them. But as someone who grew up on the ocean and spent a lot of time out there, there's a lot of power out there, certainly in the wind.
I know where I run my pilot study I'm right next to those 5 structures.
Actually, in Newburyport at the Clean Tech Center, Resolute Marine has wave energy units that are being deployed. Talking North Carolina or Alaska, point projects for aquaculture, floating things and powering, dedicated use of power. And Newburyport's kind of getting to the epicenter for that kind of development.
We got somebody way in the back there.
Isn't the monster in the closet acidification of the oceans? Maybe it connects with the question about oil and gas companies, because I can't understand why that wasn't mentioned at all in the film. Do you know why?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the entire question. Why wasn't
The
oil and
problem,
gas?
acidification of the oceans is the big problem here, right? And that's what's killing the oceans and the animals and the whales and the terns. Now, that's about oil and the gas, but it wasn't mentioned at all in the film. And of course, that's one of the reasons why we want to go to the wind-powered turbines. But it wasn't mentioned, and I just couldn't understand why it wasn't. Do you know why?
Yeah, no, I don't know why it wasn't mentioned there. But I can tell you that when we are developing this data portal through the regional planning body, one of the things we are looking at are things like increasing water temperatures. And so when you're looking at where fishing patterns are existing right now, as stocks are shifting, those are not going to be the same places where fishing is going to be occurring in 20 years from now. So some of the projections that we're starting to do to look at changing patterns, it's being incorporated. Now, ocean acidification, not as much. It hasn't been something that really has been discussed to date through this process. And I don't know why it's not included in the movie.
Just to add though, you're absolutely right that ocean acidification is an incredible threat to the ocean, and what's causing that is carbon emissions. And so we know that opportunities to clean up our electricity sector and reduce carbon emissions by advancing offshore wind, for example, and other sources of renewable energy are critical for confronting that major threat to the ocean as well as climate change. They both are coming from the same problem. And so a solution, climate solution like offshore wind, we see that as also a solution for ocean acidification as well.
I think we can agree that probably the big problem we have with the oil and gas industry is that they don't see themselves as energy companies, but rather just oil and gas companies and fossil fuel companies. And if they saw this opportunity to be an energy company, they'd be the ones pushing the offshore wind as opposed to investing money trying to defeat those projects. So those were kind of my final words about that. But any other questions? If not, then I want to thank you all for coming tonight. And we look forward to our next event in a couple of weeks. And be sure that you've signed in and given us your email address if you haven't, so that we can send you a reminder. And we look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks. Thanks.